Sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the one with the most extraordinary story. In hospitals across the country, new nurses face the usual challenges: long hours demanding patience, and the steep learning curve of saving lives. But what happens when the quiet newcomer who gets mocked by colleagues and dismissed by doctors turns out to have a past that could change everything? What if the person scrubbing bedpans and taking orders was once someone entirely different, someone whose previous life was so classified that even mentioning it could put lives at risk? This is the story of Sarah Chun, a soft-spoken woman who walked into St. Mary's Medical Center believing she could start fresh, leave her past behind, and find peace in helping people heal. She had no idea that her carefully constructed new identity would crumble in a single afternoon when the sound of rotor blades would force her to choose between the life she was trying to build and the life she thought she had left behind forever. Some secrets are too big to stay buried. Some skills, once learned, never truly fade. And sometimes the quiet person in the corner is exactly the one you need when everything goes wrong. Sarah Chun adjusted her stethoscope for the third time that morning, trying to ignore the whispered comments from the nurses stationed behind her. 6 weeks into her job at St. Mary's Medical Center, and she still felt like an outsider looking in through glass. There she goes again, checking that equipment like she's never seen it before. Linda Morrison, the charge nurse, said with a roll of her eyes. "I swear, they're hiring anyone these days. Girl doesn't have the backbone for this job." Sarah pretended not to hear as she continued her morning rounds on the cardiac unit. At 28, she was older than most new graduates, which only added to the speculation about her background. Her colleagues had created elaborate stories to explain her quiet demeanor and careful approach to everything. Some thought she was running from a bad relationship. Others assumed she was one of those people who changed careers multiple times, never finding their place. None of them came close to the truth. Room 314 needs their medication adjusted. Dr. Williams called out as he brushed past her in the hallway. He barely glanced in her direction, treating her like she was invisible. This had become routine. The doctor saw her as just another new nurse who would probably quit within 6 months, another casualty of the demanding hospital environment. Sarah nodded and made a note on her tablet. She had learned to speak only when necessary, to blend into the background, to be forgettable. These were skills that had once kept her alive in places where being noticed meant being dead. Now they served a different purpose, helping her maintain the carefully constructed identity she had spent 2 years building. The cardiac unit was busy that Tuesday morning. Sarah moved between patients with a quiet efficiency that her colleagues mistook for nervousness. Mrs. Patterson in 312 needed help with her breakfast. Mr. Rodriguez in 316 was asking about his discharge papers. The elderly man in 318 wanted someone to listen to his stories about the war. Sarah found herself lingering in room 318 longer than necessary. Harold Jenkins was 83 years old, a Korean War veteran who had been admitted with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety rather than a heart attack. His family lived across the country, and he was lonely. "You remind me of someone I knew overseas," Harold said as Sarah adjusted his pillows. "Quiet like you, but there was something in her eyes, like she'd seen things most people couldn't imagine." Sarah's hands stilled for just a moment before she continued fluffing the pillow. "I'm sure you have many interesting stories, Mr. Jenkins." "She saved my life twice," Harold continued, his eyes distant with memory. "Never told me her real name. We all called her Angel, but I always suspected that wasn't what was on her dog tags." The conversation was interrupted by Linda Morrison appearing in the doorway, her expression sour, as usual. "Chun, you're needed in the supply room. Dr. Martinez wants to review your medication administration records." Sarah nodded to Harold and followed Linda down the hallway. The supply room was cramped and windowless, filled with medical equipment and pharmaceutical supplies. Dr. Martinez was waiting with a tablet in his hands and a frown on his face. "I've been reviewing your work," he said without preamble. "Your medication calculations are perfect, your patient assessments are thorough, and You haven't made a single error in 6 weeks." Sarah waited, knowing there was more coming. In her experience, conversations that started with praise rarely ended well. "The problem is, you're too slow," Dr. Martinez continued. "The other nurses are handling twice as many patients. We need efficiency, not perfection. This isn't a classroom anymore." Behind Dr. Martinez, Linda Morrison wore a satisfied expression. She had been pushing for Sarah's dismissal since the second week, claiming that the new nurse didn't fit with the unit's culture. Several other staff members had complained that Sarah made them uncomfortable with her intense focus and unusual attention to detail. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "I'll work on improving my speed." "See that you do," Dr. Martinez replied. "We'll be monitoring your performance closely over the next 2 weeks. If there's no improvement, we'll need to discuss your future here." As they left the supply room, Sarah could hear Linda and 2 other nurses talking in low voices near the medication cart. The words "weird" and "doesn't belong here" drifted over, along with speculation about Sarah's background and qualifications. The morning continued with the usual challenges. Sarah assisted with patient transfers, updated charts, and responded to call lights. She ate lunch alone in the break room, reading a medical journal while the other nurses chatted about weekend plans and hospital gossip at nearby tables. It was during the afternoon shift change that things began to go wrong. Sarah was in room 320, checking on a post-surgical patient, when she heard shouting from the hallway. Through the window, she could see people running toward the emergency stairwell. The fire alarm had begun blaring, its harsh sound echoing through the corridors. "What's happening?" the patient asked, fear evident in his voice. Sarah moved to the window and looked outside. In the distance, she could see thick black smoke rising from what appeared to be an industrial area near the hospital. Emergency vehicles were racing down the street, with lights flashing and sirens wailing. "Probably just a precaution," Sarah said, but something in her gut told her this was more serious than a routine evacuation. Her trained instincts were picking up signs that the other staff members might miss. The urgency in the security guards' movements, the way the hospital administrators were gathering in small groups with serious expressions. "The emergency department is clearing out to make room." "What kind of chemicals?" the other doctor asked. "Industrial solvents and cleaning compounds. We're looking at potential respiratory damage, chemical burns, possible poisoning. The hazmat teams are still trying to determine exactly what was released." Sarah's blood ran cold. Chemical exposure incidents were something she knew far too well, though from a very different perspective. Images flashed through her mind. Memories of training exercises, classified briefings about chemical weapons, procedures for dealing with mass casualty events in hostile environments. She forced herself to focus on the present, helping to move patients while her mind automatically began cataloging the hospital's resources and capabilities. Without realizing it, she was thinking like the person she used to be, the person whose existence was buried under layers of carefully crafted paperwork and false histories. The evacuation was completed successfully, with all patients moved to safe areas or transferred to other facilities. Sarah found herself in the main lobby with dozens of other staff members, waiting for further instructions. Outside, she could see emergency vehicles continuing to arrive, and the smoke in the distance seemed to be getting thicker. It was then that she noticed the news crews setting up across the street. A reporter was doing a live broadcast, and Sarah could just make out the words "chemical explosion," "mass casualties," and "emergency response." Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "External event may compromise your position. Maintain cover, but be prepared for extraction if necessary." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she deleted the message. The number would already be deactivated, the message automatically erased from the sender systems. It was the first contact she had received from her former life in over 2 years, and its appearance now meant that whatever was happening at the chemical plant was serious enough to activate monitoring protocols. Around her, the hospital staff were growing restless. Some were being sent home early, while others were being asked to stay for the expected influx of emergency patients. Sarah volunteered to stay, partly because she needed the hours, but mostly because something was telling her that the day's events were far from over. As the afternoon wore on, the first casualties from the chemical plant began arriving. The emergency department quickly filled with workers suffering from respiratory distress, chemical burns, and smoke inhalation. Sarah was assigned to help with triage, taking vital signs, and gathering initial information for patients. It was chaotic but manageable. The hospital's emergency protocols were working, and the staff were handling the situation with professional competence. Sarah began to relax, thinking that perhaps the text message had been an overreaction, a precautionary alert triggered by proximity to the emergency rather than any real threat to her cover. She was wrong. The first sign of real trouble came when a paramedic approached the triage desk with a worried expression. "We've got reports of secondary explosions at the plant," he said. "Hazmat teams are pulling back. They think there might be more chemicals involved than originally thought." The second sign was the arrival of federal agents. Sarah spotted them immediately. Their suits were too crisp, their movements too purposeful, their eyes too alert. They were trying to blend in with the local emergency responders, but to someone with Sarah's background, they might as well have been wearing signs. The third sign was the helicopter. Sarah was helping to move a patient from the emergency department to the medical floor when she heard the distinctive sound of rotor blades. Through the window, she could see a military helicopter circling the hospital. Not a medical helicopter. This was clearly military, painted in the dark colors used by special operations units. Her heart began to race. Military helicopters didn't just happen to be in the area during chemical emergencies. They were here for a reason, and Sarah had a sinking feeling that the reason was connected to whatever had really happened at that plant. As she continued with her assigned tasks, Sarah found herself automatically scanning for exit routes, assessing potential threats, and noting the positions of security personnel. These were not conscious thoughts. They were ingrained responses that had kept her alive during years of dangerous assignments. The day shift was ending, but Sarah was asked to stay for the night shift due to the emergency situation. As the hospital settled into evening routines, despite the ongoing crisis, Sarah began to piece together fragments of information from overheard conversations, news reports, and emergency radio chatter. The chemical plant explosion was not an accident. Federal investigators were treating it as a possible terrorist attack. The chemicals released were not just industrial solvents. Preliminary reports suggested the presence of compounds that could be used to manufacture weapons. And somewhere in the chaos of the emergency response, someone was looking for a woman who matched Sarah's description. Someone who might have information about the chemicals, about the people responsible, about things that were supposed to be classified beyond the highest levels of government clearance. As Sarah prepared for what might be her last normal night shift at St. Mary's Medical Center, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down. The quiet nurse who had been mocked and dismissed by her colleagues was about to face a choice she had hoped never to make again. In the distance, the military helicopter continued its slow circle around the hospital, and Sarah knew that time was running out. The night shift at St. Mary's Medical Center felt different from any Sarah had experienced during her 6 weeks of employment. The usual rhythms of patient care continued, but underneath lay an electric tension that seemed to affect everyone. Nurses whispered more urgently at their stations. Doctors moved with sharper purpose through the hallways. Even the patients seemed restless, perhaps sensing the anxiety that permeated the building. Sarah moved through her assigned rounds with practiced calm, but her mind was racing. Every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward the windows, looking for the helicopter that had been circling earlier. It was no longer visible, but that didn't mean it was gone. Military aircraft had ways of staying hidden when necessary. Room 318 still held Harold Jenkins, the Korean War veteran who had spoken about the mysterious woman who had saved his life overseas. When Sarah entered to check his vitals, she found him sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the emergency lights still flashing in the distance. "Reminds me of Seoul," Harold said without turning around. The night they hit the chemical depot, nobody knew what was in those barrels until it was too late. Sarah's hands stilled on his chart. Chemical depot. Harold nodded, finally looking at her. 1952. The enemy had been stockpiling industrial chemicals, trying to figure out how to weaponize them. When our bombers hit the facility, it created a cloud that drifted over 3 villages. Hundreds of people were affected. That must have been terrible, Sarah said, her voice carefully neutral. It was, Harold agreed. But that's when I met her, the woman I told you about. She showed up the next morning with a hazmat team, but she wasn't like the others. She knew exactly what chemicals had been released just by looking at the symptoms. Saved dozens of lives with her quick thinking. Sarah continued taking his vital signs, but her mind was elsewhere. The description Harold was giving matched protocols she knew well, procedures that wouldn't be developed for general use until decades later. If Harold's mystery woman had known those techniques in 1952, she would have been part of a very small, very classified group of specialists. She ever tell you where she learned so much about chemical exposure? Sarah asked, trying to sound casually curious. Harold's eyes sharpened, and for a moment Sarah saw the intelligence that had helped him survive one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. She said she learned from people who had seen the worst humanity could do to itself. Implied she'd been places where chemical weapons weren't just theoretical possibilities. Before Sarah could respond, her pager buzzed urgently. Emergency department. Immediate assistance required. She excused herself and hurried downstairs, but Harold's words followed her. The timing of his story, the detailed knowledge of chemical warfare protocols, the way he seemed to be studying her reactions, none of it felt like coincidence. The emergency department was in controlled chaos when Sarah arrived. A new wave of casualties had come in from the chemical plant, but these weren't suffering from standard industrial exposure. The symptoms were more severe, more consistent with military-grade chemical agents than anything that should have been found in a civilian facility. Dr. Martinez was coordinating treatment protocols with a team of specialists who had arrived from somewhere else. Sarah noticed they wore generic scrubs without hospital identification, and their equipment cases bore no manufacturer markings. Everything about them screamed Federal Response Team. Chun, you're assigned to assist Dr. Harrison in Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Martinez called out. We need someone with steady hands for some delicate procedures. Sarah nodded and hurried to Trauma Bay 3, where she found a middle-aged man in severe respiratory distress. Dr. Harrison was a tall woman with prematurely gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that Sarah recognized from her former life. When their eyes met, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen the doctor before. I need you to monitor his oxygen levels while I intubate, Dr. Harrison said. This isn't going to be routine. The chemical exposure has created complications I've only seen in very specific circumstances. As they worked together, Sarah found her training taking over. Not her nursing training, the other training, the one that had taught her to function under extreme pressure with lives hanging in the balance. Her movements became more precise, her responses faster, her ability to anticipate needs almost supernatural. Dr. Harrison noticed immediately. You've done this before, she said as they successfully stabilized the patient. It wasn't a question. I've had good training, Sarah replied carefully. Not nursing training, Dr. Harrison said, her voice low enough that nearby staff couldn't hear. The kind of training that prepares you for chemical weapons exposure in a combat environment. Sarah's blood turned to ice. I don't know what you mean. Dr. Harrison stepped closer, her expression serious. Room 318. Harold Jenkins, Korean War veteran with an interesting story about a mystery woman who saved his life during a chemical attack. He's been asking the staff questions about you all day. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Harold wasn't just a lonely old man telling war stories. He was gathering intelligence, probably had been since the day she first walked into his room. The question was whether he was working alone or as part of a larger operation. Who is he? Sarah asked. Retired military intelligence, Dr. Harrison replied. Activated for special consultation when certain types of expertise are needed. The kind of expertise that might be possessed by someone who used to work in chemical weapons defense for a classified government program. Sarah felt the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. I don't know what you're talking about. Dr. Harrison pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a photograph, a military ID photo from 8 years earlier. The woman in the picture had shorter hair and different colored eyes, but the bone structure was unmistakable. It was Sarah, taken during her time with the Defense Department's Chemical and Biological Defense Command. Captain Sarah Liu, chemical weapons specialist, decorated for extraordinary service in hostile environments, Dr. Harrison read from the phone. Presumed killed in action during a classified mission in Eastern Europe 3 years ago. That person is dead, Sarah said quietly. Yes, she is, Dr. Harrison agreed. Which is why Sarah Chun, the quiet nurse who gets picked on by her colleagues, is so valuable right now. Because Sarah Liu's expertise is exactly what we need to understand what really happened at that chemical plant. Before Sarah could respond, the trauma bay was interrupted by the sound of helicopters overhead. Not one this time, but several. Through the windows, Sarah could see military vehicles arriving in the hospital parking lot, their lights cutting through the darkness. They're not here for the chemical plant victims, Dr. Harrison said. They're here for you. Sarah's mind raced through her options. Running would confirm their suspicions and probably get her shot before she made it out of the building. Cooperating would mean the end of her civilian life and a return to a world she had barely escaped with her sanity intact. But there was a third option, one that required her to trust that the people closing in on her were actually the same people she had once served. What do you need to know? Sarah asked. Dr. Harrison's expression showed relief and something that might have been admiration. The chemicals released at the plant, they're not just industrial compounds. Preliminary analysis suggests they're components of a binary chemical weapon, designed to be harmless separately, but deadly when combined. Sarah nodded. Binary chemical weapons were among the most sophisticated and dangerous compounds ever developed. The fact that civilian industrial chemicals could be combined to create them suggested either an incredibly sophisticated terrorist operation or something much worse. Who had access to the plant? Sarah asked. That's what makes this so concerning, Dr. Harrison replied. The facility was supposed to be producing cleaning solvents and industrial degreasers, standard commercial chemicals with no military applications. But someone had been slowly introducing other compounds into the manufacturing process. How long? Months, maybe years. Whatever they were planning, the explosion wasn't part of it. Our best guess is that someone made a mistake, caused an accidental release, and then tried to cover it up by triggering a larger explosion. Sarah processed this information with the analytical skills she had once brought to bear on threats to national security. You need to know if the binary compounds were fully mixed, or if there are still unmixed components that could be weaponized. Exactly, Dr. Harrison confirmed. And you're the only person within 500 miles who has the expertise to make that determination. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of the military team. Sarah could see armed figures in tactical gear, taking positions throughout the emergency department. Hospital staff were being quietly moved away from the area, leaving only essential personnel. There's something else, Dr. Harrison said urgently. The people responsible for the plant modification, they're still out there. The explosion may have destroyed the evidence, but it also eliminated their cover. They're going to need another facility, another way to continue their operation. And they'll need someone with chemical expertise to help them, Sarah realized. Someone who understands binary weapons systems. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. We think they've been recruiting people with your background. Scientists, military specialists, anyone with knowledge of advanced chemical weapons. Some have gone missing. Others have been found dead. The implications were staggering. Sarah had assumed her former identity was buried so deeply that no one could find it. But if a sophisticated organization was actively hunting for people with her expertise, they might have found ways to dig through even the most classified records. They know who I am, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. We think so, Dr. Harrison confirmed. Which means staying hidden isn't an option anymore. You're either going to help us stop them, or you're going to become their next target. The tactical team was approaching Trauma Bay 3 now, moving with the disciplined precision Sarah remembered from her own days in uniform. At their head walked a man in civilian clothes whose bearing and expression marked him as someone accustomed to command. Colonel William Reese stopped in the doorway of the trauma bay, his eyes finding Sarah immediately. She had worked with him during her time with the Chemical and Biological Defense Command before everything had gone wrong in Eastern Europe. "Captain Liu," he said formally, "you're a difficult woman to find." "I prefer Sarah Chun these days," she replied. "I understand," Colonel Reese said. "But right now we need Captain Liu. The situation has escalated beyond anything we can handle with conventional resources." Sarah looked around the trauma bay, at the patient she had just helped stabilize, at the medical equipment and civilian environment that had become her sanctuary. In a few hours, her colleagues would be arriving for the morning shift, probably wondering where the quiet new nurse had disappeared to. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah said. Colonel Reese stepped fully into the trauma bay, and Sarah could see the weight of responsibility in his eyes. "We're asking you to come home, Captain. Your country needs you again." Outside, the helicopters continued their circling pattern, waiting for an answer that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but potentially the safety of thousands of innocent people who had no idea that their morning commute might take them through a chemical weapons zone. The quiet nurse who had been mocked by her colleagues for 6 weeks was about to discover that some skills, once learned, never really leave you. And some duties, once accepted, follow you no matter how far you run or how completely you try to disappear. Sarah Chun was about to become Captain Liu again, whether she wanted to or not. The helicopter ride to the Federal Command Center took 20 minutes, but for Sarah it felt like traveling back through time. As the lights of the city passed below, she found herself remembering another helicopter flight 3 years earlier, when everything had gone horribly wrong in Eastern Europe. The mission that had officially killed Captain Sarah Liu and created the need for Sarah Chun to exist. Sitting across from her in the military aircraft, Colonel Reese was reviewing classified files on a secure tablet. Occasionally, he would glance up at Sarah, and she could see him cataloging the changes in her appearance, the way civilian life had softened some of her edges while leaving others sharper than ever. "The situation is worse than we initially thought," Colonel Reese said, raising his voice over the rotor noise. The chemical plant was just one of 12 facilities that had been infiltrated over the past 18 months. Sarah felt her stomach drop. 12 industrial plants, water treatment facilities, agricultural processing centers, all legitimate businesses that handle chemicals which could be modified for weapons production. "We've identified at least 7 that show signs of unauthorized compound introduction." The helicopter banked toward a nondescript office building on the outskirts of the city. From air, it looked like any other corporate headquarters, but Sarah could see the subtle signs that marked it as a federal installation. Too many antennas, too much security lighting, parking areas clearly designed for rapid vehicle deployment. "How long have you known about this?" Sarah asked. Colonel Reese hesitated before answering. "We started noticing patterns 6 months ago. Chemical accidents at facilities that shouldn't have had dangerous compounds. Workers developing symptoms that didn't match the official records of what they were handling. When we investigated, we found that someone with very sophisticated knowledge had been slowly introducing binary weapon precursors into legitimate industrial processes." The helicopter touched down on the building's roof, and Sarah was escorted through security checkpoints that scanned her biometrics against databases she thought had been erased years ago. Apparently, dead people could be resurrected when national security was at stake. The command center occupied the building's entire 3rd floor. Wall-mounted screens showed maps, chemical composition analyses, satellite imagery, and real-time data feeds from emergency response teams. At least 30 people were working at computer terminals, coordinating what looked like the largest domestic chemical weapons investigation in American history. Dr. Harrison was waiting for them, no longer wearing scrubs. In her federal agent attire, she looked like the senior intelligence operative she clearly was. "The lab results from the plant explosion came in an hour ago," she reported. "Your initial assessment was correct. Binary compounds, military grade, designed for maximum dispersal through industrial ventilation systems. Sarah studied the chemical analysis displayed on a nearby monitor. The compounds were sophisticated beyond anything she had seen outside of the most classified government research programs. This isn't the work of some terrorist group that got lucky with internet research, she said. Someone with access to classified weapons data designed these formulations. That's what we're afraid of, Colonel Reese replied. Which brings us to why we need you specifically. He led Sarah to a secure briefing room where additional files were waiting. As she reviewed the documents, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The infiltrated facilities formed a network spanning 3 states, all connected through a web of shell companies and dummy corporations that traced back to a single source. Meridian Industries, Sarah read from the file. Supposedly a chemical engineering consulting firm. But according to this, they've been placing personnel in strategic positions at facilities across the region. Personnel with very specific qualifications, Dr. Harrison added. Chemical engineers with military backgrounds. Industrial safety experts with clearance histories. And they've been actively recruiting people with your exact specialty. Sarah found herself looking at a list of names she recognized, former colleagues from the Chemical and Biological Defense Command, scientists from classified research programs, technical specialists who had worked on the most sensitive projects in chemical weapons defense. At least a third of the names have been crossed out in red. Dead, she asked. Missing or confirmed deceased, Colonel Reese confirmed. All within the past 2 years. All deaths appeared accidental or natural until we started looking for patterns. The implications were staggering. Someone was systematically eliminating the people best qualified to understand and counter advanced chemical weapons, either to prevent them from interfering with a planned attack or to recruit the survivors for their own purposes. There's something else, Dr. Harrison said, pulling up a new file on the secure computer terminal. We think they know about your survival. 3 weeks ago, someone accessed medical records at St. Mary's Medical Center, specifically looking for staff members who match certain physical and educational criteria. Sarah's blood ran cold. What criteria? Asian American women between 25 and 35 with advanced knowledge of chemistry or medicine hired within the past year. Colonel Reese read from the file. The search was sophisticated enough to bypass normal security protocols. They're looking for me specifically, Sarah realized. Not just someone with my skills, me personally. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly, which means they either know you survived Eastern Europe or they figured out that Sarah Chun is Sarah Liu. Either way, your cover is blown. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, people were going about their normal evening routines, unaware that someone was planning to turn their industrial infrastructure into a delivery system for chemical weapons. And somewhere else, people who had once been her colleagues were working to make that plan a reality. What happened in Eastern Europe, she asked. The real story, not the official version. Colonel Reese and Dr. Harrison exchanged glances before Colonel Reese answered. You were investigating reports of a new type of binary chemical weapon, something that could be transported safely in separate components and assembled at the target location. Your team was ambushed while examining a suspected weapons facility. I remember that part, Sarah said. What I don't remember is how I survived when everyone else died. Because you were betrayed by someone on your own team, Dr. Harrison said quietly. Someone who knew the mission parameters, the location, the timing. Someone who made sure the ambush would eliminate all the witnesses except one. Sarah turned back to face them. Except one. You, Colonel Reese confirmed. But we think the betrayal was designed to let you escape. To make you believe everyone was dead. To force you into hiding and to eventually draw you out when they needed your expertise. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a picture that made Sarah's carefully constructed life feel like an elaborate trap. The explosion at the chemical plant, that wasn't an accident. They knew I was working at St. Mary's. They caused the explosion to force a federal response that would require someone with my background. It's possible, Dr. Harrison agreed. The timing is suspicious. 3 years of silence, then suddenly an incident that would inevitably draw you out of hiding. Sarah returned to the conference table and reviewed the files again, this time looking for patterns she might have missed. Names, dates, locations, chemical compositions, all of it began to form a larger picture of an operation that had been years in the making. Meridian Industries, she said finally. Show me everything you have on their personnel records. Colonel Reese pulled up a series of files containing employee photos and background summaries. Sarah scanned through them methodically, her memory searching for faces she might recognize. When she reached the seventh file, she stopped. Marcus Webb, she read from the screen. Chief Chemical Engineer, hired 18 months ago. The man in the photo was older than she remembered, his hair grayer and his face harder, but Sarah would have recognized him anywhere. He had been part of her team in Eastern Europe, one of the 3 people who had supposedly died in the ambush that had forced her to fake her own death. You know him, Dr. Harrison observed. He was my partner, Sarah said quietly. In Eastern Europe, he was supposed to have died with the others. Colonel Reese leaned forward. Are you certain? Sarah studied the photo more carefully, comparing it to her memories of that night 3 years ago. Marcus had been standing next to her when the first explosion started. She remembered him pushing her toward the extraction point, telling her to run while he held off their attackers. She had believed he was sacrificing himself to save her. It's him, she confirmed. But if he's alive, then he was part of the betrayal. He helped set up the ambush that killed the rest of our team. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Marcus Webb hadn't just survived Eastern Europe. He had orchestrated the mission's failure. And now he was in a position to coordinate chemical weapons production across multiple civilian facilities. We need to bring him in, Colonel Reese said. You can't, Dr. Harrison replied. Meridian Industries is too well-connected, too protected by legitimate business covers. If we move against them directly, they'll disappear and relocate their operation somewhere we can't find it. Sarah was still staring at Marcus Webb's photo, her mind racing through the tactical implications. They don't know that I know he's alive, she said. From their perspective, I'm Sarah Chun, the quiet nurse who got drawn into this accidentally when the chemical plant exploded. What are you thinking? Colonel Reese asked. Sarah turned back to the group, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to think like Captain Lou again. I'm thinking that Sarah Chun might be exactly what they're looking for. Someone with the right expertise who doesn't know she's being hunted. Someone who could be recruited into their operation. Dr. Harrison caught on immediately. You want to go undercover. Let them approach you. It's the only way to get inside their organization and find out how extensive this conspiracy really is, Sarah explained. But it means going back to being Sarah Chun, returning to the hospital, and waiting for them to make contact. Colonel Reese looked skeptical. That's extremely dangerous. If they suspect you're working with us, then I'll be in the same position I was in 3 years ago, Sarah finished. Except this time, I'll know who the real enemy is. The room was quiet while they considered the proposal. Outside, the night was giving way to early morning, and Sarah knew that in a few hours, the day shift would be arriving at St. Mary's Medical Center. Linda Morrison would probably be wondering where the quiet new nurse had disappeared to. There's something else we need to consider, Dr. Harrison said. If we're right about the scope of this operation, the chemical plant explosion was just the beginning. They have compounds in place at multiple facilities. They could trigger coordinated releases at any time. Sarah nodded. The binary chemical weapons she had identified were designed for maximum dispersal and lethality. If someone activated them simultaneously across multiple locations, the casualty count could be catastrophic. How long do we have? She asked. Colonel Reese consulted another file. Intelligence suggests they're planning something for next week. There's been increased communication between the compromised facilities, and several key personnel have been taking leave or changing their schedules. 1 week to infiltrate a sophisticated conspiracy that had been years in the making. 1 week to prevent what could be the worst chemical weapons attack in American history. 1 week for Sarah Chun to become Captain Lou again without anyone noticing the transformation. I'll need support, Sarah said. Communication protocols, backup extraction plans, and a way to neutralize the compounds if they try to activate them while I'm inside. Already being arranged, Dr. Harrison confirmed. But, Sarah, once you go back in there, you're going to be completely on your own. We can't risk exposing the operation by maintaining too much contact. Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. In a few hours, she would return to St. Mary's Medical Center as the same quiet nurse who had left for her shift the previous evening. But everything had changed. The life she had built as Sarah Chun was about to become the cover for the most dangerous mission of her career. One more thing, she said as they prepared to return her to the hospital. My colleagues at St. Mary's, they need to be protected. If this goes wrong, Marcus and his people might target anyone who knew me. Colonel, he's no dead. We'll have security in place, but it will be invisible. As far as anyone knows, Sarah Chun just had an eventful night shift during a chemical emergency. As they prepared for another helicopter flight, Sarah found herself thinking about Harold Jenkins, the Korean War veteran who had been asking questions about her background. She had thought he was just a lonely old man sharing war stories. Now, she realized he might have been the first contact from the people who were hunting her. The quiet nurse was going home to face her past, armed only with her ability to pretend that her world hadn't just been turned upside down. And somewhere in the city below, Marcus Webb was probably planning the next phase of an operation that could kill thousands of innocent people. The helicopter lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying Sarah back toward a life that was no longer real and a mission that might be her last. Sarah returned to St. Mary's Medical Center as the morning shift was beginning, slipping back into her role as the quiet nurse with practiced ease. To her colleagues, she had simply worked a long night shift during the chemical emergency and gone home to rest. None of them noticed the subtle changes. The way she now automatically scanned every room for potential threats, how her attention sharpened when strangers approached the nurse's station, or how she had developed an almost supernatural awareness of everyone around her. The hospital was returning to normal operations, but the aftereffects of the chemical plant explosion lingered. Several patients remained in critical care, and federal investigators were still conducting interviews throughout the building. Sarah used this disruption to her advantage, moving through the hospital with the kind of systematic observation that would have been suspicious under normal circumstances. Harold Jenkins was still in room 318, but now Sarah understood his presence differently. When she entered for his morning assessment, she found him reading a newspaper with unusual attention to the chemical plant coverage. Terrible business, Harold said without looking up from the paper. Makes you wonder what else might be out there hidden in plain sight. Sarah checked his vital signs with steady hands, but her pulse was racing. The investigators seemed to think it was an industrial accident. Harold finally looked at her, and Sarah saw intelligence in his eyes that had nothing to do with his age. Sometimes the official story is the one designed to prevent panic. Sometimes the truth is too dangerous for general consumption. I wouldn't know about that, Sarah replied carefully. I just take care of patients. Of course, Harold agreed. Though it's interesting how quickly someone with your background adapted to emergency chemical exposure protocols. Almost like you'd seen similar situations before. The conversation was interrupted by Linda Morrison appearing in the doorway with her usual disapproving expression. Chun, you're needed in the emergency department. Dr. Williams wants to see you immediately. Sarah excused herself and followed Linda downstairs, her mind racing through possibilities. Had someone discovered her absence the previous night? Had Harold Jenkins reported his suspicions? Or was this the contact she had been expecting? The emergency department was busy, but not chaotic. Dr. Williams was standing near the main desk, talking with a woman in a business suit who looked vaguely familiar. When they saw Sarah approaching, the conversation stopped. Nurse Chun, Dr. Williams said formally, this is Dr. Amanda Foster from the Center for Disease Control. She's investigating the chemical exposures from yesterday and needs to speak with staff members who were involved in patient care. Dr. Foster extended her hand with a professional smile. I understand you assisted with several of the chemical exposure victims. I'd like to review your observations about their symptoms and treatment responses. Sarah shook the offered hand, noting the slight callus on the index finger that suggested regular firearms training. not typical for epidemiologists. Of course, I'm happy to help however I can. They moved to a small conference room near the emergency department, where Dr. Foster set up a tablet and began asking questions that seemed routine on the surface, but were clearly designed to assess Sarah's knowledge of chemical weapons effects. The patients you treated, did you notice any unusual patterns in their symptoms? Dr. Foster asked. Anything that didn't quite match standard industrial chemical exposure? Sarah chose her words carefully, balancing her real observations with what a civilian nurse might notice. Some of them seemed to have respiratory distress that was more severe than I would expect from the chemicals that were supposedly released. Supposedly? The preliminary reports mentioned industrial solvents and cleaning compounds, Sarah explained. But the symptoms I saw were more consistent with. She paused, as if searching for the right words. I'm not sure how to describe it. Something more concentrated, more designed to cause damage. Dr. Foster made notes on her tablet, but Sarah caught a brief expression of satisfaction. Have you ever seen anything like this before? During your training, perhaps, or in previous employment? No, Sarah leads smoothly. Nothing like this. It was actually quite frightening to see how quickly some of the patients deteriorated. They continued the interview for another 20 minutes, with Dr. Foster probing Sarah's background, her education, her reasons for becoming a nurse, and her observations about the chemical emergency. Throughout the conversation, Sarah maintained the persona of Sarah Chun, competent but not exceptional, observant but not suspiciously so. As they concluded the interview, Dr. Foster handed Sarah a business card. If you remember anything else, please contact me directly. Sometimes details come back to people after they've had time to process traumatic events. Sarah returned to her regular duties, but the business card felt like a loaded weapon in her pocket. The contact had been made, exactly as Colonel Reese had predicted. Now she had to wait for the next move, while pretending her world hadn't fundamentally changed. The rest of the day passed in manufactured normalcy. Sarah took care of her assigned patients, endured the usual comments from colleagues about her quiet demeanor, and tried to ignore the federal agents who were still conducting interviews throughout the hospital. But she was constantly aware of being watched, evaluated, measured against some criteria she could only guess at. It was during her dinner break that her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee tomorrow? Meridian Cafe on 5th Street, 3 p.m. Foster. Sarah deleted the message immediately, but her hands were trembling slightly. The Meridian Cafe. The name wasn't a coincidence. They were signaling that the real recruitment was beginning. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment with a strange sensation of living in a movie set. Everything looked the same. Her carefully chosen furniture, her medical textbooks, her small collection of plants, but none of it felt real anymore. This wasn't her life. It was a stage where she performed the role of Sarah Chan, while Captain Liu prepared for what might be her final mission. She spent the night reviewing everything she knew about binary chemical weapons, refreshing her memory of detection protocols and neutralization procedures. If she was going to infiltrate Marcus Webb's organization, she needed to be convincing as someone with valuable expertise who didn't know she was walking into a trap. The next day, at the hospital, passed with excruciating slowness. Sarah found herself checking the clock constantly, aware that each hour brought her closer to a meeting that would determine whether she lived or died. Her colleagues noticed her distraction, but attributed it to stress from the previous day's emergency. You seem jumpy, Linda Morrison observed during the afternoon shift change. Maybe you're not cut out for the high-pressure situations we deal with here. Sarah almost smiled at the irony. If Linda only knew the kinds of pressure situations Sarah had dealt with in her previous life, she might have been more impressed with the quiet new nurse's ability to function normally while preparing for a covert operation. At 2:45 p.m., Sarah left the hospital and walked the 6 blocks to Meridian Cafe. It was a trendy coffee shop in the downtown business district, busy enough to provide cover for a clandestine meeting, but upscale enough to suggest that whoever was funding this operation had significant resources. Dr. Amanda Foster was already seated at a corner table when Sarah arrived. She had changed from her CDC persona into more casual attire, but her alert posture and constant scanning of the room marked her as someone with security training. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Foster said as Sarah sat down. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of ordering you a coffee. Colombian blend, black." Sarah's blood chilled. She had never mentioned her coffee preferences to anyone at the hospital, but Colombian black was exactly what she would have chosen, which meant they had been observing her for longer than she had realized. "I was intrigued by your message," Sarah said, accepting the coffee but not drinking it. "I wasn't sure what else you might want to discuss about yesterday's emergency." Dr. Foster smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, I want to talk about your background. Your personnel file at St. Mary's is remarkably sparse, almost like someone created a new identity rather than transferring existing credentials." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, even as her pulse accelerated. "I'm not sure what you mean. I graduated from nursing school 2 years ago and worked at a clinic in Oregon before moving here." "The Pacific Northwest Medical Center," Dr. Foster said, consulting her phone. "Interesting facility. Very small, very specialized. They seem to have a lot of staff members with unusual backgrounds." Sarah realized she was in immediate danger. The Pacific Northwest Medical Center was part of her cover identity, but apparently Dr. Foster had investigated deeply enough to discover that it was connected to classified programs. She needed to end this meeting quickly without revealing that she understood the implications. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable with this conversation," Sarah said, starting to stand. "If you have questions about my credentials, you should speak with the hospital's Human Resources Department." Dr. Foster's hand moved to her purse, where Sarah caught a glimpse of metal that looked like a concealed weapon. "Please sit down, Sarah. Or should I say, Captain Liu." Sarah's training took over. Without appearing to move aggressively, she shifted her weight and angled her chair to give herself a clear path to the exit. The cafe was crowded enough that Dr. Foster probably wouldn't risk a confrontation, but Sarah couldn't be certain. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Sarah said, remaining standing. "My name is Sarah Chun, and I need to get back to work." "Your name is Captain Sarah Liu," Dr. Foster said quietly. "You worked for the Defense Department's Chemical and Biological Defense Command until 3 years ago, when you were supposedly killed during a classified mission in Eastern Europe. But you survived, didn't you? And now you're exactly what we've been looking for." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. This wasn't a recruitment meeting, it was a confrontation. Dr. Foster knew exactly who she was, which meant the careful cover identity that had protected her for 3 years was completely blown. "We," Sarah said. "Who exactly is we?" Dr. Foster smiled again, and this time Sarah saw genuine warmth in her expression. "People who appreciate your unique qualifications. People who have been working on projects that require expertise in chemical weapons defense. People who can offer you a much more interesting career than changing bedpans in a hospital. And if I'm not interested, then you continue your life as Sarah Chun, and we respect your choice," Dr. Foster replied. "But I think you'll find our offer compelling once you understand the scope of what we're working on." Sarah remained standing, calculating distances and probabilities. The cafe's front entrance was 20 feet away through a crowd of customers. The bathroom was closer, but probably had no useful exit. Dr. Foster was positioned to block the most direct route to the street. "What exactly are you offering?" Sarah asked. "Dr." Foster pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of photographs. Industrial facilities, chemical processing equipment, laboratories that looked both sophisticated and secret. The chance to work on the cutting edge of chemical defense technology. The opportunity to prevent attacks rather than just treat the victims afterward. The images looked impressive, but Sarah noticed subtle details that suggested they weren't entirely what they appeared to be. The equipment was too new, too clean, too perfectly arranged for active research facilities. These looked like facilities designed to impress potential recruits rather than conduct actual work. "Where are these facilities?" Sarah asked. "Various locations," Dr. Foster replied vaguely. "Security considerations prevent me from being more specific until you've committed to joining us." Sarah nodded as if considering the offer, but her mind was racing through extraction protocols. She needed to get out of the cafe, contact Colonel Reese, and report that her cover was blown. But she also needed to maintain the pretense long enough to gather useful intelligence about the organization that was trying to recruit her. "This is a lot to think about," Sarah said. "I'd need time to consider leaving my current position." Dr. Foster checked her watch. "Of course, but I should mention that time is somewhat limited. We're beginning a new phase of our operations next week, and we'd like to have you on board before then." Next week. That confirmed the timeline Colonel Reese had mentioned. Whatever they were planning was imminent, which meant Sarah's mission had just become exponentially more urgent. "Understand," Sarah said. "How would I contact you with my decision?" Dr. Foster handed her another business card, this one with different contact information. "Call this number tomorrow evening." "But, Sarah, or Captain Lou, I should mention that this opportunity won't be available indefinitely. We've invested considerable resources in finding you, and we expect a commitment one way or another." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah Chun could refuse their offer, but Captain Lou might not survive the refusal. Sarah pocketed the business card and nodded politely. "I'll be in touch tomorrow evening." As she turned to leave, Dr. Foster spoke again. "Oh, and Sarah, you might want to be careful about your evening walks. The city can be dangerous for someone with your background." Sarah left the cafe without looking back, but she could feel Dr. Foster's eyes following her until she turned the corner. Once she was out of sight, she allowed herself to acknowledge how badly the situation had deteriorated. Her cover was blown, her location was known, and she was being actively hunted by people who had been planning this for months or years. But she had also gained valuable information. The organization was large enough to conduct extensive surveillance, sophisticated enough to penetrate classified records, and confident enough to approach her directly. And they were planning something for the following week that required her specific expertise. As Sarah walked back toward the hospital, she noticed the black sedan that had been parked across from the cafe was now following her at a discreet distance. The surveillance had become overt, which meant they were either very confident in their position or very concerned about losing track of her. Sarah Chun was about to discover just how dangerous it could be when Captain Lou's past caught up with her present. And in 6 days, thousands of innocent people were going to pay the price if she couldn't find a way to stop what was coming. Sarah returned to St. Mary's Medical Center knowing it might be her last normal shift as a nurse, but determined to maintain her cover until the final moment. The black sedan had followed her to the hospital parking lot, where it took up position with a clear view of all exits. Her hunters were no longer hiding their presence, which meant they were confident she had nowhere to run. Inside the hospital, Sarah moved through her evening routines with mechanical precision while her mind calculated options and probabilities. She had less than 24 hours before she was supposed to call Dr. Foster with her decision, and perhaps only days before whatever the organization was planning would be unleashed on innocent people. Harold Jenkins was still in room 318, but when Sarah entered for his evening assessment, she found him sitting fully dressed on the edge of his bed, as if he had been waiting for her. "Time for honest conversations, don't you think?" Harold said without preamble. The games and pretending are about to become dangerous for everyone involved. Sarah closed the door behind her and checked that the hallway was empty before responding. "You're not just a retired veteran, are you?" Harold smiled grimly. "Retired, yes. Veteran, absolutely. But also someone who's been keeping an eye on certain situations for people who care about national security. The woman I told you about in Korea, the one who saved my life, she taught me how to recognize people with specialized training. And you recognized me the moment you walked into this room 6 weeks ago," Harold confirmed. "Chemical weapons specialist, probably Defense Department background, definitely someone trying very hard to disappear. The question was whether you were running from something or running to something." Sarah sat down in the visitor's chair, abandoning the pretense of a routine patient check. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That you were running from something that caught up with you yesterday," Harold replied. "The federal agents, the mysterious interviews, the meeting at Meridian Cafe this afternoon. All of it suggests that your quiet life as Sarah-chan is over. Sarah stared at him. You've been watching me. We've been protecting you, Harold corrected. There's a difference. The people who've been looking for you aren't interested in bringing you back to active duty through official channels. They want to recruit you for something that would make your previous work look like a training exercise. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a secure communication device, military grade, encrypted, the kind used for classified operations. Colonel Reese has been trying to contact you. The situation has accelerated beyond what anyone anticipated. Sarah took the device and activated it with protocols she hadn't used in 3 years. Colonel Reese's voice came through clearly despite the hospital's interference with normal communications. Captain Liu, we have a critical situation, Colonel Reese said without preamble. Intelligence indicates the target facilities will be activated tomorrow night, not next week, as we previously believed. We're looking at coordinated chemical weapons releases across 12 locations in 3 states. Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. How many potential casualties? Conservative estimate is 30,000 dead within the first hour, another 100,000 injured or exposed. This would be the largest chemical weapons attack in history. Harold was watching Sarah's face as she processed the implications. Tomorrow night meant they had run out of time for careful infiltration and intelligence gathering. Whatever was going to happen, they needed to stop it in the next 18 hours. What changed the timeline? Sarah asked. Your meeting with Dr. Foster, Colonel Reese replied. We monitored the conversation from a distance. They know you're aware of their real purpose, which means they can't afford to wait any longer. They're moving to the activation phase immediately. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking through the tactical situation. 12 facilities, coordinated timing, sophisticated chemical weapons. This required a level of coordination and expertise that couldn't be improvised at the last minute. The organization had been planning this for years, and they were confident enough in their preparation to accelerate the timeline when circumstances required it. Do we have locations for all 12 facilities? Sarah asked. 11 confirmed, 1 probable, Colonel Reese replied. But here's the problem. They're too far apart for conventional response teams to neutralize simultaneously. We need someone inside their operation, someone who can disrupt their coordination at the source. Sarah understood immediately. You need me to accept their recruitment offer. It's the only way, Harold said. If you call Dr. Foster tonight and agree to join them, they'll bring you to their central command location. From there, you might be able to sabotage their coordination systems. The plan was insane. Sarah would be walking directly into the hands of people who had been hunting her for 3 years, trusting that she could outmaneuver them while they were in the final stages of executing the largest terrorist attack in American history. The odds of survival were minimal. There's something else, Colonel Reese continued. We've identified Marcus Webb's location. He's coordinating the operation from a facility outside the city, an abandoned pharmaceutical plant that's been converted into a command center. If you can get inside, you'll have the chance to confront the man who betrayed your team in Eastern Europe. Sarah felt a familiar cold anger settling in her chest. For 3 years, she had believed Marcus was dead, had mourned him as a fallen colleague who had died protecting her. Learning that he was not only alive, but responsible for the deaths of their teammates had rekindled emotions she thought she had buried with Captain Liu. What about extraction? Sarah asked. If I'm going in alone, how do I get out? Harold smiled grimly. You don't. This is a one-way mission, Captain. You go in, stop the attack, and hope that we can find you before they do. Sarah set down the communication device and looked around the hospital room that had been her workplace for 6 weeks. Through the window, she could see the lights of the city, millions of people going about their evening routines with no idea that their lives might end tomorrow night in clouds of chemical death. There is one other option, Harold said quietly. You could run, disappear completely, create a new identity so deep that even these people couldn't find you. You've done it before. Sarah considered the possibility. She could walk out of the hospital right now, steal a car, drive until she reached the Canadian border or a major airport. In 48 hours, she could be on another continent with a new name and a new life. The organization might succeed in their attack, but she would be safely out of range. How many children are in the target zones? Sarah asked. Harold consulted his secure tablet. Approximately 8,000 under the age of 12. Another 15,000 teenagers. Sarah closed her eyes again, seeing the faces of her young patients, remembering the children's ward at St. Mary's where she had sometimes helped during busy shifts. Chemical weapons didn't discriminate by age, but children suffered more severe effect from exposure. Most of the young ones wouldn't survive the attack. I need to call Dr. Foster, Sarah said. Harold nodded and handed her a secure phone. This number will route through multiple relays. They won't be able to trace the call back to this location. Sarah dialed the number from DR. Foster's business card, forcing herself to breathe normally while she waited for the connection. I was hoping you'd call, Dr. Foster answered on the second ring. Have you reached a decision? I'm interested, Sarah said, but I need to understand exactly what you're offering. The work you mentioned, the facilities you showed me. I want to know what I'd actually be doing. Of course, Dr. Foster replied. We can arrange for you to visit our primary research facility tomorrow evening. You'll have the chance to meet the team leaders and see the scope of our operations firsthand. Tomorrow evening? Is that a problem? I know it's short notice, but we're beginning a new project phase, and it would be ideal to have you on board from the start. Sarah forced enthusiasm into her voice. No, that sounds perfect. I'm excited to see what you're working on. Excellent, Dr. Foster said. Someone will pick you up at your apartment tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pack light. You may be staying at the facility for several days while we get you oriented. After ending the call, Sarah sat in silence for several minutes. Tomorrow at 6 p.m., she would get into a car with people who intended to use her expertise to kill thousands of innocent people. She would be taken to Marcus Webb's facility, where she would have one chance to prevent the largest chemical weapons attack in history. Are you ready for this? Harold asked. Sarah stood up and straightened her nurse's uniform for what might be the last time. Captain Liu is ready. Sarah Chun is terrified. Harold extended his hand, and Sarah shook it with the grip of a fellow soldier. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to walk into hell and fight the devil on his own ground. Sarah left room 318 and completed her shift as normally as possible, saying goodbye to patients and colleagues who would never know how close they had come to losing everything. Linda Morrison made her usual disparaging comments about the quiet new nurse, never realizing she was talking to someone who was about to risk her life to protect the hospital and everyone in it. As Sarah prepared to leave the hospital for the last time, she stopped by the children's ward and looked through the window at the sleeping young patients. Tomorrow night, if she failed, similar children in 12 different cities would never wake up. Outside, the black sedan was still waiting in the parking lot. Sarah walked past it without acknowledgement, knowing that in less than 24 hours, she would be in the custody of the people watching her. The quiet nurse who had been mocked and dismissed by her colleagues was about to become the last line of defense between civilization and chemical catastrophe. At her apartment, Sarah spent the evening preparing for what would likely be her final mission. She reviewed chemical neutralization procedures, practiced techniques for disabling electronic equipment, and wrote a letter to Colonel Reese explaining her real motivation for accepting this assignment. She wasn't just trying to stop a terrorist attack. She was trying to avenge her fallen teammates and, finally, put to rest the guilt that had haunted her since Eastern Europe. Marcus Webb had betrayed them all, and tomorrow night, Sarah would face him as Captain Liu, not as the broken survivor who had spent 3 years hiding from the truth. As she prepared for bed, Sarah looked around the apartment that had been Sarah Chen's home. The medical textbooks, the carefully chosen furniture, the small collection of plants, all of it would be left behind, artifacts of a life that had served its purpose. Tomorrow evening, the quiet nurse would disappear forever, and Captain Sarah Liu would return to finish what had started 3 years ago in Eastern Europe. The helicopter that came to extract her would be carrying her toward a confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of thousands of innocent people who would never know her name. Some missions were worth dying for. Some betrayals demanded justice regardless of the cost. And sometimes the person everyone underestimated turned out to be exactly what the world needed when everything was falling apart. Sarah Chun closed her eyes for the last time, and Captain Liu prepared to wake up.